What is thy bidding, my master?
The trans surgery enterprise is now a $300 million per annum growth industry.
I have felt it.
I've essentially been banned from Twitter.
How is that possible?
A few days ago, I penned an irritated tweet in response to one of the latest happenings on the increasingly heated culture war front. In response to the decision of an actor named Ellen Elliott Page. I am employing this awkward and impossible naming style because it is now apparently mandatory and am probably doing it wrong nonetheless, as you're doing it wrong is the whole point of what is being made mandatory.
He's just a boy.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
All right. I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, by our trusty graphic designer, J. Andrew World, and by super producer, union organizer, man about town, Jacob Appett. How you guys doing tonight?
Muted. I'm doing good.
Yeah, I'm doing good. I was waiting for Andy.
Nice. So we have, I wish we could actually have a link tonight, but we do have big news. The tickets are going to go on sale for the Los Angeles live show on Friday. It's going to be at the Terragram Ballroom in LA. That is going to be a GTAA / This Is Revolution / Left Reckoning event. So you can, it's going to be me and Jason Miles and David Griscom and various other people from the GTA Extended Universe. And the guests are going to include our friends Anna Sparian and Nando Vila. And obviously many more people to be announced. So it should be a very good time. All right. So we are, we'll have, this time we actually should be able to include a link to the tickets. We put out the podcast version on Friday. It was an empty promise last week. There were various details to be worked out, but we can do it now. So meanwhile, for tonight at 9:00, I'm going to be speaking to William Paris from the What's Left of Philosophy podcast about his work on utopianism in both popular and academic context. Should be a really interesting conversation. And before that, we are going to talk about a couple things. One of them has to do, is the subject of an article that I wrote for Jacobin this week. It actually came out yesterday, called Ben Shapiro thinks that, quote, Marxism can't work in America, unquote. He is very confused. So we are going to watch the video in which he exhibits this confusion, and that should be a lot of fun. But as Pink Floyd so wisely teach us, if you don't eat your meat, you can't have your pudding. So we do have other pre-put-in activities to get to tonight. And I want to start by talking about somebody I just mentioned, because she's going to be at the LA live show. and who's also comes up in what you're about to listen to, who is our great friend Anna Kasparian. So because of actually, it's really a shame that people didn't watch, that the main thing people aren't watching isn't the discussion I had with her on this show last week, which is like the sort of, I think, obviously the best version of what she has to say about this stuff. But some of the recent reporting on street crime and related issues on the Young Turks has caused a lot of controversy on Twitter, and I do want to say a couple things to set it up, but what I'm going to play for you in a minute is a discussion I had a couple days ago on the Collins Show. So the guest was another Ben Spielberg, and I had that Ben on because I want to talk to him about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is indeed what we did, for like the first half hour of that discussion. But as you're about to hear in a minute, in a very unplanned way, right? Because of I'd seen him get into it with Anna about some of the crime stuff a couple hours before we were supposed to record, and I had stuff I wanted to ask him about that. So I kind of asked him, "Hey, would it be okay with you? I know this is what you're kin to, what you were planning to talk about, right? But would it be okay with you if we got into it a little bit?" And he's a very very accommodating person. I said, "Yeah, no, that's totally fine, right?" So we actually had what I think was a really good discussion about it, and I think a very good faith and very substance heavy discussion about it. So I was really happy about that. But I think, well, actually, let me just say this. So I think if you watched the episode last week, you have some idea of what all that was about. If you didn't watch the episode last week and you're not on Twitter, and by the way, if you're not on Twitter and you have no idea this stuff is going on, you've made just unfathomably better life choices than anybody you see on the screen, and you should keep it up. And I'm very jealous of you, but that you don't know what's going on. I think the beginning of the calling conversation probably gives you most of the context that you need for that. But basically, there's an issue here about how the left should be thinking and talking about sort of public concerns about rising crime rates, what that how that relates to longstanding left concerns about mass incarceration and criminal justice reform, related issues like mental health and addiction services, homelessness, right? There's like a whole cocktail of late capitalist dysfunction, that gets mixed together in this conversation. But and I think that I think most people who have various takes on how we should think and talk about this do, I think, agree on most of the policy stuff, right? I'm not saying necessarily 100%, right? I think particularly, when you get down to the level of like local prosecutors who, like progressive prosecutors who are trying to do their best with the extremely limited set of tools that are available to them once you're downstream enough from those original problems, right? All those dysfunctions of, late capitalism we just mentioned, that you're dealing with like the tool set available to a local prosecutor. And I think, and I think there's some real dilemmas, and and I think there is room for criticizing some decisions that people have made. But whatever you think about whether like this DA in this place made the right call about something or not, I think on broader, more larger scale issues, right, about demilitarizing the police, about having like a more humane and rehabilitation focused prison system, I think there's probably much more agreement than not. And so I was thinking about what, if anything, I wanted to say about this that would add to what I say in the sort of impromptu, friendly debate, with Ben Spielberg that we're about to listen to. And I think the only thing that I would add at this point, is this, right? That, and this is like a little fuzzy, right? Apologies in advance, right? I mean, it's like a little bit, I don't know. Maybe this is a little bit too hippie-ish of me, right? But like, I guess the vibes worry me, right? Let's just put it that way. Let's just lead all the way into the hippiness and say that the vibes worry me. I think that what I get when I look at a lot of this discussion, right? When I sort of abstract from the who said what about who and, all of that stuff, right? That is a real sense that after the defeats of 2020 and, for those of our listeners in Britain, 2019, right? But particularly in America in 2020, and all of the, horrible stuff that happened, right? The defeat of the second Sanders candidacy, COVID, whatever. And the sort of rise of like a really, militantly reactionary sort of post-Trumpist right wing, right? That I feel like a lot of leftists are acting like they're hunkering down for a period of like extended defeat. And that a lot of the way we're talking to each other about this stuff reflects that. Because I think that when people are, in a optimistic frame of mind, they actually think that some real victories are possible on this stuff, then instead of sort of being paranoid about who's like not really on the right side or whatever, like I think people are going to be much more inclined to try to focus on how they can sort of pitch our message at people who share the sorts of concerns about some of the stuff that like somebody like Anna has articulated in the discussion, right? So that's my meta vibe worry, and I think that's the only extra thing I have to add. Is there anything either of you guys want to throw in?
I saw you across the bar, and your vibes weren't. Sorry, that's all I could think of.
If someone says that to you at a bar, there's like a 95% chance they look like Andy, in my opinion. If we saw you from across the bar, and we really liked your vibe. I had some thoughts on how Twitter transformed this conversation, but maybe should we check out the debate first before getting into some of that? Yeah, absolutely.
And by the way, we're probably not going to watch the entire thing right now, right? But let's watch a big substantive chunk, give people a sense of the discussion.
All right, cool.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. All right. So I want to be, while we still have a decent amount of time, but I'll switch gears right now and ask you about something else that I wasn't planning on talking about before. In fact, I don't know that I've seen you particularly talk about this before, but like a couple hours. Yeah. Well, a couple hours ago, I happened to see an exchange on Twitter that you were involved in, and it was with Anna Kasparian, and it was about criminal justice reform, basically, and then it's a little bit too a little bit too germane to my interest not to ask about while I've got you on the phone.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm cool. That sounds fun.
Okay, outstanding. All right. The starting point of this discussion was a video that Anna had done on the Young Turks and your objections to that. But I don't want to go too granular to start with, because I think for anybody who hasn't watched the video and followed all the ins and outs of this, it's just not going to mean anything. So I do want to maybe just kind of start out with the broader issue, right? So I think that I think there's a concern that I know Anna has that I tend to share actually about left messaging on some of the stuff about criminal justice reform, because I think I'm sure this isn't completely true. I think there were some like maybe policy disagreements that even came up a little bit in that exchange. But my suspicion is that everybody involved in this discussion would probably agree on most of the policy stuff, right? In other words, I don't think anybody in the discussion is like, I don't know, pro mandatory minimums or, against banning no-knock raids or anything like that. But I think that, but I think there's a concern that can arise about how we talk about this, right? Because, I think that certainly if you look at the polling data, right, I think that there's a lot of evidence that most working class people, including most working class people of color, take concerns about crime and rising crime rates and all of that pretty seriously, right? That this is a real issue, for a lot of people, right? Could these kinds of concerns about public safety I think you and I would say, it's sort of downstream of a brutal economic order, right? That leads to that leads to all of this, right? But it's but the symptom itself is very real, right? And there's and I think there's a way that there are a lot of ways that I at least see people who I generally agree with talk about this stuff that I find kind of unhelpful, right? Like that I'll see people react to people talking about, crime rates, upticks in crime rates by saying, oh yeah, well, it's still way lower than it was in the 1990s, which, I think, I think sounds very dismissive in a very unhelpful way. I think that some of the slogans people have used, ranging from like some of the abolish stuff that like DSA passed, back in like 2017 to up through, even like the defund slogan, which is a little bit ambiguous about what it means. There are different ways to read that, but I think it hits a lot of persuadable voters the wrong way, right? Because it sort of sounds like austerity, and you're just kind of on your own. So I guess like one entry point into the discussion would be like, how much do you think those are like, legitimate concerns, or like how much do you think that like the way that the left talks about this stuff right now is the way that we should talk about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I think I'm often hesitant to critique things like defund the police or abolition. And personally, I would say that I do believe in police abolition. But it's partially just because I think oftentimes, and I know that this is not the case with you, obviously, but I think that oftentimes there's a critiquing of progressive or social justice messaging that's actually a critique of the goal that's veiled as a messaging critique. And so, what I appreciate about people in the abolition movement and in the defund movement is that they've really brought this issue into the public consciousness in a way that's hard to ignore. And I think there can sometimes be value in using kind of inflammatory language, like abolish ICE, I think is a good example of something that, again, you could argue it turns people off, but it also really, I think, brought to the forefront a lot of issues that needed to be discussed in a different way. And I think there have been some wins also, if you look at from a policy standpoint at local jurisdictions dealing with people who have used some of that language. Some of them have responded in terms of actually reallocating portions of their budget or rethinking their relationship with police forces. So I think I'm a little less critical of the wording, but what I do agree on and what I think is legitimate is there's a real concern here that people have which is their safety. Like, you want to walk down the street and you want to know that I am not going to be assaulted and like feel comfortable walking down the street. And I think people also want to know that if something does happen to me, I want to have somebody to call. And I think the problem, in my view, with how we've often approached these issues as a social justice movement is it's focused largely on explaining the very true point that the police and the criminal legal system don't tend to make us safer. There's a lot of research behind that. It's true that usually when you call the police, they don't really provide much help. Like, all of that's true. And I think it's an important point to make, but it doesn't answer the question for somebody who's concerned about this stuff. And like you said, persuadable people of like, what do I do? Who do I call? How do I know that I'm going to feel safe? And I think you have to have a response to those sorts of questions if you really want people to be persuaded. It's not enough to just say the system that we have sucks and we need a totally different economic order. You need to say, well, here's what should be happening instead, and here's what we can see. Because what you'll see when you do have those conversations, and I think like the victims' rights movement, I don't love the word victim and I don't love the word criminal. The victim rights movement, I think, is really interesting. And it's because, like, when you ask people who have been harmed by crime what they want to see, if you give them alternatives to incarceration, things like a restorative approach where they're involved in thinking through what the harm reparation method is, they tend to like that way better than like a draconian prison sentence. Not everybody, but like most people who have been harmed by crime, they don't just want you lock somebody away for life and that's the end of the story. They actually want something that actually helps repair what happened to them. So I really think there's got to be more of a focus on concrete solutions in these debates. I think it's super important to point out the problems with the narrative. And, you know, my issue with Anna's presentation and her segment that she did was it really bought into these very privileged defending tropes that you often see from people who oppose all of the policies that, you know, hopefully she does agree about many of the policies, but there was a lot of language and framing that really mirrors people who are opponents of this movement. So I think that people who recognize that there may be a problem with aspects of how sometimes we engage on this issue as social justice advocates just need to be really intentional and thoughtful about how we bring up and talk about that problem ourselves.
Okay. Yeah, so that was really interesting. I'm glad you said the thing about criminals, because that was actually the tweet that caught my eye this morning was when you objected to her using that word. I definitely want to talk about that. But you know, I think okay, so I mean, just to lay some of my own cards on the table about this, right? I think you know, I certainly think that we could have I mean, I'm sympathetic, you know, I wouldn't claim to be anything like an expert on it, but I'm, you know, from what I know about it, I'm quite sympathetic to some of the restorative justice stuff you talked about. I had a good conversation on here with Ryan Lake about that a while back. I think, you know, I certainly think that if it was, you know, done in combination with moves towards a more economically equal society, so we wouldn't have, you know, people wouldn't be as spooked about crime in the first place. I certainly think we could have like a vastly more sort of humane and rehabilitation focused, you know, criminal justice system without that leading to, you know, to really bad results, right? I mean, I think that an analogy I think that Annie even used somewhere in there, I don't actually remember. I watched the whole segment you're talking about. I also talked to her about this on my, you know, the main show on YouTube on Monday night, so it's all kind of jumbled together, but I'm pretty sure Norway came up in, you know, one or both of those, I don't remember. And you know, and I do think that that's a good model, right? In other words, like, I think it's like good sort of real life proof that you could have a more humane and rehabilitation focused criminal justice system and also a much lower rate of violent crime than the United States. You know, that you can have both, at least given better, you know, material conditions, right? You know, lead into less crime. I'm completely down with all of that. But I guess one okay, so there's like the rhetoric part of the policy part, and I want to talk about both, and and I want to do it all, in a relatively relatively concise way, or at least I'm really going to try. So let's, on the the rhetoric part. I mean, the sort of concern I have about saying like, oh, don't call people who may be incarcerated for murder or rape or etc. Violent criminals. I worry can be a little come off as a little tone deaf, right? I mean, like, because people, you sort of talked about privilege defending, but I mean, like, I think that there is a certain sense in which, like, it is a privilege, it is a position of privilege to not really have to worry about street level violence, in the way that you don't really have to worry about it that much if you live, in a middle class kind of neighborhood, where and there are, again, so I worry about minimizing the concern, but I don't want to focus too much on that, because I think that the more interesting question maybe is on some of the policy goal stuff, right? Because it's like, look, do I think we could get to Norway? Absolutely. Do I think that if we had a completely different economic system, then like further down the line we could go even further in that direction? Yeah. Do I think that we could ever get to the point where you like, it wouldn't make sense, you like, when you talk about like police abolition or prison abolition, right? That there wouldn't be somebody that you would call in the instance of, if something violent happens, that there wouldn't be some mechanism to remove people who are violent from society. I'm somewhat skeptical about that, frankly, even in a sort of like 23rd century, full communism sort of scenario. But like, I think the more
Ben, can I interject on the rhetoric point there before you go further on that? Just because
Yep.
I think the people who are violent and the kind of violent criminals piece, I think, are related in a way, just because what I would say is people are more complex than that. So, and we have lots of people in our society who we don't label violent or violent criminals, who perpetrate far more violence against others. I think you and I would probably agree about that. But, there are high level people who orchestrate violence against whole communities when they make policy decisions. And then there are people who harm others, but because they live in areas that aren't particularly policed, they sometimes don't have their violence result in prison time. Now, obviously, murder is a very extreme case, but even if you just look at kind of police officers involved in officer-involved shootings and people who might be oftentimes lower income who have murdered somebody, the way that we talk about those as a society is very different, in a way that I do think creates a problematic frame for the issue, because police violence is still violence. So unless you're walking around calling it... Right, I know you don't have to agree.
I completely agree with that. Although one way to maybe sort of, turn that around a little bit is that I think that that cops who shoot people without justification, should be...
You'd call them violent too.
Yeah, I'd call them violent criminals too. And like, also, to put an even finer point on that, I mean, I think it's really important that we imprison, right, cops who are engaged in unjustified shootings, right? I mean, when Wilson was convicted, right? I mean, I wrote an article in Jacobin saying, I mean, maybe it's kind of a hyperbolic headline because it's a very small victory, right? But that the conviction was a victory for justice and democracy. Meaning that, like, I think that it's bad for democracy if state officials can get away with crimes and not be punished, right? That it's important that that happened, right? I do want to, if it's okay, I do want to go back to something you said a few minutes ago, because I actually think it's like a really interesting way to frame the discussion, which is that you sort of made an analogy to the Abolish ICE slogan. Yeah. And I guess where I would see a disanalogy between Abolish ICE and Abolish the Police is that, I find very often, and maybe this is unfair, this is anecdotal, right? But I find very often when I talk to people who do use slogans like "abolish the police," that like some of those follow-up questions that I think you were rightly raising earlier, right? About how that plays out in practice. Oftentimes, it doesn't really feel like people have some things to say about it, like here's a like here's a program that that does some good, etc., that doesn't involve any policing, but like the idea that there's a sort of global replacement that they I often get this uncomfortable sense reading these people that that they're really there really aren't good like fully fleshed out answers to those questions. And oftentimes when pressed on them, right, people will say things like, well, we can't do it overnight or something like that, which one, I think if you can't do it overnight, I I sort of think you could you're making analogy to abolish slavery, where like the whole reason nobody would call for when a Republican
Ben, you're getting muddled. So I heard can't abolish it overnight.
Which I sort of think, well, if so, if what you really mean is try to gradually phase it out over time, and you're not even totally sure what that would look like, but like maybe someday have as a very long-term horizon, you could have a society without a need for it. I think the word abolish is poorly chosen, but I also think, like in the ICE case, right, the difference to my mind with ICE is that no, literally, I actually do want to abolish ICE. Like, we could do without ICE, like in the short term, like we could, like that could be a very rapid transition to ICE not existing, right? I think that you can have, one, it hasn't existed for very long, but like also like I don't want to be lean too hard on that, because taken literally, that makes it sound like I think the INS was fine, which I don't, right? But like I think I actually don't think a free society needs to have a policing branch that purely exists to round up otherwise law-abiding people for just like being in the country without permission, right? Like I don't think that's a function we need to have, right? I think that you can probably find a few legitimate functions of ICE, and you can have other law enforcement agencies do those, but like ICE itself, right, the sort of core mission is a mission that I don't think would exist. I think we could actually just do away with the agency without changing very much else, and that would be okay. And in that case, I feel like there's a sort of clear enough vision for what abolishing it would mean, and there's a there's a sort of clear, and there's this like very clear moral case. And I think it's even easy to understand that, right? Like, and which is not to say that it's necessarily popular, or you don't necessarily have an uphill battle, but I mean, I'm kind of willing to wage that uphill battle. Whereas in the case of abolishing the police, I think most, there are polls where like Black voters specifically are asked, like, do you think the police presence in your neighborhood is too much, too little, or about right? Right. And the one that's always the least popular option is too much, right? Because even though people are perfectly aware that cops can be racist and abusive and horrible in many, many ways, the idea of taking that away. Yeah, exactly. The idea of taking that away sounds, still sounds worse. And, and I think certainly if you took it away under present material conditions, I mean, that sounds really bad. I mean, that sounds like, that sounds uncomfortably like, sort of libertarian dystopia where there's like, private security for people who can afford it and nothing, for everybody else. All right, so it keeps going. I think there's like another, 20 minutes or something after that. We're not gonna be able to play the whole thing, obviously, today. People can check out the call-in episode. We'll put a link to that in the description for here. But I think that gives you, a nice, sample of the debate. And I will say that, whereas I do think other Ben was being uncharitable to Anna, I think, that's really my only criticism. Other than that, I think he's, I think it was a good, I think it was a good discussion. I don't think he sloganeered. I don't think he sort of retreated into, the kind of like self-righteous platitudes, that people sometimes do when they're talking about this stuff. I think he was very very earnest and transparent about where he's coming from, and it was good. I mean, this is what I don't know. I mean, I already said the vibe thing earlier, so this isn't more hippie-ish than that. But but like, I think if all the intra-left discussions about this stuff were like that, that would be, better.
Yeah, well, kind of what I was going to say earlier, to contrast it, right, with how this discussion kind of played out on Twitter. I didn't see what Ben, the other Ben, tweeted, but I'm forgetting his last name, but I shared it
Spielberg.
with you, Ben. No, sorry, Adam. Adam.
Oh, Adam Johnson.
Yeah, I think so. Just
The
at a certain point, we had Adam saying that Anna and the Young Turks are basically at like Fox and Friends level sloganeering, and then Anna, was kind of in her own right saying like, "Oh, so you don't care about crime victims?" So I feel like, it just reminded me that Twitter arguments tend to devolve into that place where you're basically doing these like ad hominem attacks, and like it's near conspiratorial, I think, to say.
I don't know. Every time I'm in, there's like some massive pile on Twitter that I'm on the wrong end of. I'm always like really reasonable. I never, I never get defensive or say anything I shouldn't, or at least I can't think of any instances of that.
I actually can't, but
well, that's nice of you to say, but yeah, I think we all do, right?
It's a very emotionally charged platform, but I think for someone who, I would just count myself as someone who's still trying to make up their mind about some of this stuff. So I think it's good to listen to well-meaning people actually kind of hash it out, as opposed to just accuse each other of either being like fascist propagandist or saying like, oh, well, you don't care about victims. Because I think for the most part, I assume most people are, feel bad for people who whose family members are murdered. And I think, most, if you spent like the majority, 99 to 100% of your career pushing for left-wing policies, you're probably not a Fox News propagandist unless your name is Tulsi Gabbard, and I think her record is not 99% pushing for leftist ideals, but you have to you
certainly not a recent record.
Yeah, some people actually do drift rightward, and I think that's legitimate. But when you disagree with someone on one point and then you start saying, oh, they're just whatever Tucker Carlson level. So anyway, I
would specifically say on that, right? I mean, again, I'm not going to lean too hard into criticizing any individual's Twitter behavior, but I think but I think that abstracting from what Adam might have said or any other person might have said, right? I mean, I think that there's certainly like a kind of accusation that was in the mix that I find particularly ridiculous here. That it's like, well, you must just have some ulterior motive, right? For saying this, right? Which is like, a lot of people on the left, like this is their like one move for processing serious disagreement with people that they normally agree with, right? Is to say, oh, you must be a grifter, right? Who's paying you, to say these things, right? Now, maybe there was some foundation that gave a grant to Jacobin once, and if I trace it back 5 steps, I can see, who's paying you, to disagree with me. It's like, no, sometimes people just, sometimes people just disagree, right? Like that's, that happens. And in this case particularly, I actually think that like raising some of these concerns about crime, like this is not, I don't know. I mean, if I were to take up grifting and I wanted to, I was thinking about the old, there was an episode of Community where there was where they taught a class at the community college called that was actually called Introduction to Grifting. But if I were to take up grifting, right, I was just going to like pretend to believe things, to appeal to an audience, and the audience that we're trying to appeal to was the like super progressive TYT audience. I don't think this is how I do it, right? I think that might even be, counterproductive if that was the goal. So anyway, I do want to switch gears, I do want to switch gears and talk. We talked about Ben Spielberg, so there's another very similar person, also named Ben, also with a Jewish last name, also a carbon-based life form. So basically, pretty much identical to Ben Spielberg, right?
Ben Stiller, right?
Yeah, I am, of course, talking about Ben Stiller. That's no. Ben Shapiro has some thoughts. And this is the last thing I want to cover before we bring on William Paris from What's Left of Philosophy. Ben Shapiro posted this video about I think it was like a little over a week ago, but it's certainly not much longer than that. That is called, as you can see there, "Marxism Can't Work in America." So it caught my eye. I wanted to see what he had to say, let's just let a little bit of it roll. See how he starts it out.
Really funny to imagine this being Ben Stiller. Marxism can't work in America. He just becomes like a right-wing demagogue. All right, let's check it out.
When you have high levels of societal income mobility, when you can be born in America and you can become very, very wealthy, when you can be a middle-class person and you can get rich, very difficult to make the case that the system is stacked against you. So the left had to come up with another way to ram their cultural Marxism through. And what they came up with was race. Because while the United States historically has not had massive class distinctions that are hard and fast, it has had race distinctions that were hard and fast for the vast majority of America's lifetime, right? Until the 1960s. So from 1776 to the 1960s, you had hard and fast racial distinctions in law in many parts of the country. And that was a serious problem. So what the Marxists did is they glommed onto this and they said,
okay, let's pause that.
What we need to do is make Americans understand.
Okay, so I just want to say, so far, the narrative of socialist history and American history that other Ben has given us here goes like this. America has never had hard and fast class distinctions, and so Marxists had a problem, right? How do they pitch Marxism in America? And what they came up with, one golden brainstorming session, was race. That instead of class, they were going to talk about race.
We have those discussions all the time, in private. We're like, how are we gonna sell this shit, because America is so equal. There's so little inequality.
We have the race channel on our Slack. that we're always figuring out how to.
We had Marxism on a whiteboard and we crossed it out and we wrote cultural Marxism instead because we realized it wasn't working. But sorry.
Yeah, exactly. This is like, okay. I mean, first, I maybe unkindly say in the Jacobin article I wrote about this, I'd really like to imagine Ben Shapiro being transported, from going in a time machine, going back 100 years from, 2022 to say 1922 when the Coal Wars were going on in West Virginia, and like just like putting him in the middle of that and having him explain to some coal miners who are like dodging bullets from Pinkertons that there was no inequality that like affected white people in America. That the only sort of troubling inequality, was racial. So that's one thing. Second thing, and we haven't even got into his like most interesting claim here, but second thing, I don't know, Matt. I mean, I'm thinking as like, if you think about America before the civil rights movement really got going, right? Like 1930s, 40s America. Part of what Ben is saying is true, right? It is true whether or not you explain it as a result of coming up with race, because Kant's on class, right? That it is true that like groups like the Socialist Party and the Communist Party were among the very few predominantly white organizations that actually did prioritize the struggle for racial equality in America at that time, right? That's absolutely true, right? You know, look at people, you know, I mean, you look at the history of like, you know, communist organizing, of, you know, sharecroppers. You look at you know, some of what, you know, A. Philip Randolph was doing, all that stuff, right? That's actually true. But I don't think that's because that was the only thing that people were interested in, right? I don't actually think that like getting people to talk about, to like focus on racism was the easy part in America in like the 1930s.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Go ahead, Jake.
No, I was saying who goes ahead. No, I think if slavery was in practice right now, we'd probably spend a lot of time talking about it, you know, and not in like a race reductionist way. Just that there's like some, you know, it's just something horrible that's going on. That if you want to fight for justice, that's something that, you know, these type of people were going to fight for. I don't think he was thinking that deeply about Marxist history, though. That's like almost too charitable.
Yeah, fair. And
I just don't think he thinks that deeply.
But yeah, and then the one thing we kind of didn't touch on is he's conflating social mobility, which is also low in America, with class. That if you're able to change classes, and that means there's no class system, right? But that has barely anything to do with Marxism, right? Yeah, I can't even begin to. I mean, obviously, Marx knew that there was not like a caste system of different classes or like feudal lords and aristocrats, and like that's the whole point of why any of this even makes any sense, right? Like, obviously, that's not the case of what we had in America. But even by those metrics, we actually have like lower than average. Like, you could statistically look up like someone who's born in poverty in America versus like another economically wealthy nation. What are their chances of getting out of that poverty, right? And it's actually lower than, you know, most other countries with a similar economic profile, right? So
no, I mean, yeah. So in the Jacobin article, I linked to some empirical information about this. The United States is actually pretty low in upward mobility among advanced Western nations. In fact, interestingly enough, some of the nations that are highest in upward mobility are like Denmark and Norway. So, you know, make of that what you will.
the Marxists there are very upset because they can't bring Marxism there, so they have to do race.
Yeah, exactly. You know, they're like, and it's much harder to trick people into the cultural Marxism using race in Norway. So yeah,
it's the homogeneity. How did you say that word? Homogeneity of the people there.
Oh, homogeneity.
Yes, homogeneity.
Yeah, yeah. No, exactly. So, I mean, again, you think about America in the decades. You know, I mean, like the civil rights movement. In the sort of the form that was ultimately successful, like really gets going in like the 50s, right? You know, you think about America in the 30s and 40s when, you know, you really do find like, you know, it's an exaggeration, but it's not as much of an exaggeration as you might think to say that it's like only socialists and other radicals who are like talking about that, right? That like, okay, but this is not because like this is what they settled on. Right, to get people to like, it's like, oh, this is our sneaky way of like getting Marxism into the water supply. You know, that like we're gonna talk about race. In fact, I'm pretty sure just talking about class was the easy part in like America in the 30s and 40s. I mean, this is an era when like I was just talking to Sean Richman, also on the Collins show yesterday, actually, about the Communist Party's trade union sort of front organization, the Trade Union Unity League, which led like 250,000 workers out on strike. This is before the CIO started. This is an era where even the Socialist Workers Party, right, which is like a small Trotskyist party, led like successful general strikes in Minneapolis, it's a mid-sized American city. I think there was actually a pretty big audience for class-based appeals at the time, right? I don't think that you just you're gonna have to talk about race because nobody wants to hear about economics in America during the Great Depression, right? So that's one thing, but I think that the main thing, which is going to come out even more strongly in what we're about to watch, is what Jake just said, right? That like the core premise of all this, like even if America really did have Norway levels of upward mobility, which by the way, I think I think there are actually some predictable reasons why some of those social democratic policies would lead to greater levels of upward mobility, that the paying for people's college and, all that stuff. Right. But like, even if the United States did have Norway levels of upward mobility, even if for the sake of argument, the United States had Norway in the 21st century levels of upward mobility all the way back to 1776, like Ben said earlier, which is, very not right. Like, let's just put it that way. Right. But even if it had, it would all be completely irrelevant, right? Because the socialist objection to the level of economic inequality that's produced by capitalism has absolutely nothing to do with upward mobility. That's an unrelated question. So I do want to get into that, but let's watch a little bit more of the video.
That the systems are racist, and you need to tear down the systems so you can have essentially racial mobility. That is the only way to do this. So that was the argument that was made by critical race theory. So critical race theory arrives in the 1960s. Stokely Carmichael, who's then the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he makes the argument on the heels of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, right? The first real movement in America to undercut this argument. Because the argument is now, okay, we're going to get rid of those race distinctions in federal law. So we've reached the end of the road, right? I mean, we've now gotten rid of any excuse you have for some sort of revolution based on class. Stokely Carmichael says, no, that's not good enough. The systems are already stacked based on class. It's not that the systems are fair, but they were excluding people. And so if you include the people in the systems, now things are good. The entire system is racist and bad.
Okay.
And we can tell because there's inequality in outcome. So any system that has an...
Okay, that's probably enough of that. So,
thank God.
Yeah, I do. I mean, racial mobility is a fun phrase, right? Because it sounds like if you work real hard, maybe you can change your race. But anybody who's read Philip Roth's novel *The Human State*, I guess that's a story about racial mobility. But in any case, like being more charitable than that, right? That like what I find amazing about this is that when Ben Shapiro takes the like 3.5 things he's heard about history and then like sticks it together with his like a priori speculation about what people must have been thinking, he assumes so deeply that the only thing that anybody could object to about inequality is the lack of upward mobility. That like that's his imagination is so severely limited that he thinks that like even Marxists, if they're like objecting to economic inequality, it must be because they don't think there's enough upward mobility, right? Like that is the only possible source of any complaint that like anybody could have about this.
Yeah, I mean, in his worldview, 1965 Civil Rights Act, that should put worrying about racism to bed. And the fact that there's any sort of upward mobility at all in America, which is, I don't know what society he's comparing it to, where he was kind of saying like in those societies you could do the class thing because I don't know if he's thinking of like Russian feudalism or something like that. But yeah, I mean, there's this like, ingrained belief, like we've talked about on the show, in the meritocracy, right? And we've also talked about how socialists want to go beyond meritocracy, like what Kyle Kaczynski was. I think I'm saying his name wrong, but like Klinsky, sorry, yeah, he was talking about. He was kind of defending more of a meritocratic vision, right, when he was talking with Jordan Peterson, and that's maybe a social democratic point of view. But I think most socialists would say that, like, you know, even if you are, you know, much better at or, you know, much faster at putting together widgets in the factory, that's not necessarily the measure by which we should decide like who gets to eat and who doesn't. So it is just such a he's just so impressive at efficiently packing so many bad ideas into such a short period of time that we only had to show like 2 minutes and we had plenty to talk about. So I do want to give him credit for that.
That is a skill, you know, that you have to really work at to have that bad of a take. But yeah, no, I am also thinking, like, you know, a lot of times we don't talk about the civil rights movement before 1950, whatever, whenever the Birmingham bus boycott happened, because that was what, 54, I think. But like, you know, it was going on a long before that. I mean, you know, a lot of people forget this, but Plessy v. Ferguson was considered a civil rights win at the time. That they thought that separate but equal would work out. That's, of course, you know, obviously not true, but, you know, that was at one point where the you know, the civil rights movement was at a certain point. So like it's a fascinatingly long history, and you know, that we almost passed something like the 1965 Civil Rights Act in 1875.
Yeah,
like,
I do have to say, by the way, I mean, there was another one in 1965. I think Shapiro means 64, but yeah, that's
yes,
like super duper petty. But yeah, no, I mean, I mean, yes, everything you just said, yes, absolutely, right. I think that, you know, but like, it is, again, the thing that I find the most revealing is that, you know, Shapiro assumes that everybody, even the most radical people, right? The Marxists, the, you know, whatever, Stokely Carmichael, who he thinks invented critical race theory, what, you know, all these people, right? That he thinks that like the only goal that any of them could have is like remove fetters to the best and brightest from each group, rising to the top of the class structure, right? That they that like, or at least rise into an appropriately high level in the class structure. And that's kind of amazing, right? Like just to the sort of level of capitalist realism involved there is just off the charts, you know, that like, you know, I mean, I would like to think that like reactionary demagogues in previous generations, for whom the, you know, communist threat or whatever was a little bit more immediate, we're at least a little bit more aware of what communists thought, because it just seems like, no, that has nothing to do with it, right? I mean, yeah, liberals, sure, right? You know, that's like, there's a lot of liberalism that really is about like, let's have like a pure meritocracy, right? But like the whole, you know, the thing about meritocracy is that it's structurally impossible that everybody is going to meritocratically advance at the same time, right? I mean, like that there are, you know, not every cheerleader can be on top of the pyramid, right? You know, it's so, it just seems like if you are, doesn't seem like it is like, right? Like if you redefine justice to just mean unhindered meritocracy, that like you're just in, justice has absolutely nothing to do with the needs of the majority of the population. Right? That's because, you know, the purest meritocracy ever wouldn't help most people. And it's and again, like the objection that, you know, I mean, you know, Shapiro is framing it in terms of Marxism, but I mean, like, you know, I mean, it's on a sort of much more rudimentary level, just like any sort of like anti-capitalist critique is going to make to the level of inequality that's produced by capitalism, right? I mean, you could have, you know, could have a little bit of inequality, you know, as a treat, but you know, the level of inequality that's produced by capitalism is one, nobody should be subjected to the conditions, the people on the bottom end of that, right? And everybody deserves better than that. And two, that, socialists have always understood that level of like inequality in the distribution of resources comes downstream of a really profound inequality in the distribution of power. And that's the real objection, right? I mean, this is the stuff, we didn't really have time to talk, and we're not going to have time, I think, to talk about the Salman Rushdie piece that ended Jacobin. But I mean, this is the thing that I really emphasized in there about like the sort of connection between thinking about free speech and thinking about socialist politics. That the sort of core of it, right, is that CLR James line about how every cook can govern, right? That the sort of core of socialist politics is thinking that like it's not just that there are a few people who are capable of self-government and they can decide like what everybody else is, what's safe enough to expose everybody else to, right? That you think everybody's capable of self-government, right? Being exposed to every perspective and making up their own mind and all of that stuff. And and again, it's just it's fine to disagree with that, but like it just seems to me that like this is the kind of thing you say, right? Like, oh, these Marxists must think that there's not enough upward mobility, otherwise I can't figure out what they're saying. If like you've lived your life in such a way as to very carefully insulate yourself from ever having to talk to one.
It's like that meme I saw this weekend, which said, how am I supposed to laugh at this? This is a right winger speaking. How am I supposed to laugh at this? There's no racist jokes in here.
Yeah, I mean, I just, whatever. Like, I guess the only time that I can think of in years that Shapiro has exposed himself to someone well outside of his ideological bubble was, go back to earlier in the conversation, Anna Kasparian last fall, I believe.
That sounds right.
And I guess it took more than that hour. It's going to take more than that hour conversation to get him to internalize any of it. So, I would urge him to take a refresher course and talk to some other leftists. But if not, it's going to be funny, and we're going to get continual material for the show. So I guess I'm a little conflicted about it. Like I sort of want to preserve him in the purity of what he's doing right now. But meanwhile, toward the end of the hour, Dr. Jenn is going to come on for the philosophy segment. Then we're going to go to the postgame with Dr. Kuba from This Is Revolution, where we are going to hear some extracts from. Actually, you want to just for like 20 seconds, Andy, you want to tease what we're going to listen to?
Oh, I thought this was Jake's thing, but yeah, we can easily tease that.
Oh yeah, the Hillary Clinton co-authored a novel. It seems a loosely autobiographical White House set thriller. So I've been begging Ben to let us read some of that on air. We had some shuffling around, and I finally said, Ben, I think it's time. I'm gonna be drinking a little bit, and we didn't have anything else that we had to do, so it's we'll see if
it's time.
We can't do this sober.
We'll see if the patrons like it.
Emphatically not. But again, Pink Floyd, meat comes before pudding. So for some meaty discussion of utopianism, let us bring on William Paris from What's Left of Philosophy. How you doing, William?
Hi, I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I've been curious to chat with you about this stuff for a while. This isn't just completism that you're the only person from your podcast who hasn't been on here.
No, I understand.
But yeah, no, I am very curious about this. So like, one thing that like one of the articles that you sent me to look at to kind of prepare for this discussion, you say is that in sort of like ordinary, like mainstream political discourse, like to call something utopian is like, is like a really stark way of dismissing it, right? And it's like, oh, that's just utopian. But of course, also in in our tradition, right? The word utopian, has some negative connotations too, right?
Absolutely.
There's this whole tradition of Marxist criticism of utopianism. So you want to maybe kind of start us off with like what you mean by it and why you see some value there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the best way to understand how I think of utopianism is to kind of look at it as I'm trying to go back to, what were some of the original uses of utopia when it emerged in political traditions. And so one of the things I sent you is me talking about Thomas More. I think, a lot of people have the idea that what Thomas More meant by utopia was simply this place of impossibility. It's a type of quietism. It's nice for intellectual or imaginative reflection, but it's a way of avoiding politics. And so in the left tradition, that's normally what the critique of utopianism is. It's moralism. It thinks that you can simply just exit social contradictions and create castles in air, and has no science behind it. But what you find in Thomas More that I think is really interesting, whatever the substance of his own politics, but there's evidence that aspects of his politics are more radical in his own moment, is that it's a tool for social critique. And so, if you look at the book Utopia, what he's doing is only the second book, the second half of the text is about the supposedly perfect society. And even then, he doesn't even think, the author doesn't even describe it as a perfect society. But the first book, which I think is really interesting, is, it's really this dialogue of, an adventurer who saw the supposedly perfect society and him trying to decide what is my role in political society now. And you can see that what's going on in the book is Thomas More is finding his own way of saying he's critiquing the enclosures that were happening in England in I believe, the 14th century. He's making this, claim pretty much that, if you cut people off from the means of subsistence, why should you expect them not to steal? Why should you expect them to hold on to some sort of moral purity? And so
Hmm.
what Utopia actually does is to say that, the status quo often says, oh, that's utopian, that's impossible, that's fanciful, but it's an attempt to reveal that what we think of as the normal course of things and yet are constantly mystified by the systematic repetitions of things like crime or violence or poverty actually is a way of saying that what you take to be a realistic, that is the most utopian thing around. That you think that you can kind of oppress people, that you can cut them off from any means of
Mm.
self-determination, and think that they'll still remain moral angels, that will still remain a perfect society. It allows you a vantage point from which to grasp how your society, what your society takes as normal, what it takes as unchangeable, and the reasons it gives itself for that, and to challenge those reasons and say that those reasons aren't fundamental, these things are not unchangeable, and that we need to have a sense that things could be otherwise. And so my notion of utopia is not about constructing a perfect society in my head. It is about how do we denaturalize certain assumptions that we take for granted in political discourse and show that, taken on their own terms, are rather internally contradictory and thus should be challenged on that basis rather than simply assuming their terms of the argument and trying to make it work.
Yeah, it's really interesting that your point of reference here is Thomas More, who, um, I think, like I don't know, like I think about Thomas More, I think about like Wolf Hall, and that the sort of depiction of him as this like kind of terrifying Catholic arch reactionary.
That is a side to how he's described, and it's also partially why people who are more conservative,
Mm.
it's not just Thomas More. Obviously, people who are contemporary conservatives worry about utopianism mostly because they're drawing on 20th century experiences with communism,
Mm.
and utopianism and Marxism communism are collapsed into one, and so utopianism for I think a lot of more conservative people, it's like this fervor of simply remaking social life according to your own whims. But yeah, you're right. Thomas More is a complex figure, and it's unclear how much of those scary and awful things are true.
Sure.
I understand there's still sort of disputes about that, but I take it that it's still important philosophically because I think it's important to understand why this concept of utopia has all of these affective resonances around it. And I think for a lot of people, it speaks of a type of surety that has no place in politics and is not available to democratic contestation, that it is simply hostile to difference. I think that that's the incorrect reading of major strands of the utopian tradition, but we can talk more about that.
Yeah, no, that's good. So, because I think this gets down to, I mean, you sort of mentioned it earlier, right? But I mean, it's worth taking a minute on the sort of traditional Marxist critique of at least one thing that was called utopianism, which is about sort of creating a perfect society in your head,
Mhm.
and there are, I take it, right, at least a couple of reasons to sort of object to that, right? So if what like the utopian socialist is traditionally conceived is like thought to be doing is they're sort of, I don't know, they've got some principles about justice maybe, and they're sort of they've designed a society that would be in perfect accord with those principles, and then they're just like going to sort of work backwards from that, right? You should like, what's the difference between what we've got and that? Well, anything that's not that, right? Must be objectionable. Why don't we have that? And there are a lot of reasons somebody might object to that, but I think the two that have been like sort of historically important for Marxists are one, something, like, I don't know, I guess historical materialism, that the
Mhm.
idea that like what possibilities are present at any given time sort of flows from material conditions at that time, that they that and then and you can't just like extrapolate it a priori, right? It's sort of things become possible at different points in history. And
Mhm.
then the second, I think you already kind of mentioned, which is this sort of idea that that there's something sort of almost anti-democratic about the idea of like just sort of starting with this idea of a perfect society, right? That like
Mhm.
that that if that like if I mean I actually like if people are I was, when I'm making this point, right, I was, even though I actually live in Georgia, right, I was changing to Brooklyn because it's just funnier somehow, but they have
Mhm.
a like if you think like people like sitting at a coffee shop in Brooklyn and in 2022, right, are going to like come up with exactly what like the socialist future is going to be like, and you're just sort
Mhm.
of expecting everybody to just do that, right?
Agree and go along. Yeah.
Yeah. Then they think, well, hold on, right? I mean, isn't there's this whole strand of Marx's
Mhm.
thought that probably informs Marx's own reluctance to do what he called writing recipes for the cook shops of the future, that certainly reflected stuff like what Rosa Luxemburg wrote about the Russian Revolution, that you say, well, no, you're going to run into all these unpredictable problems, and then you're going to need these sort of mass democratic energies in the masses to sort of like engage in this process of deliberation to like figure out what the best solutions are to this problem. So
Mhm.
it's just not possible, right?
Yeah.
In to sort of formulate exactly what the future should look like
Yeah.
a priori. And I take it that like you're sympathetic to those sorts of concerns about at least that sort of version of utopianism.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And all at once, I don't want to deny that, of course, utopians and those who are part of the utopian
Mm,
tradition have done that, have had that idea. But I also tend to be suspicious, and I guess this is my
mm,
spicier take. I think how large a part of that is of the utopian tradition has been a bit overblown by mid 20th century political experiences, especially specific philosophers who, I'm not saying how I feel about them one way or another. I always get in trouble. Like, Arendt is a big one in the human condition. She describes utopia as kind of a desire to escape the messy plurality of humanity.
so
And she even,
though I also don't know how much advice I'm going to take about not being utopian from somebody who thought that legally prohibiting private sector discrimination was a bridge too far.
yeah, I mean, yeah. So I'm obviously with you there, like but you have Hannah Arendt, you have people like Karl Popper, and the big one who probably has a lot to say about how we got to the place that we are is someone like F.A. Hayek. And his notion of utopianism is a way of destroying the spontaneity of market orders. It's a dream of centralism. It's an impossible dream, but if it's not impossible, it's absolutely destructive. Sometimes there's this tension of, if it's impossible, then why do you need to worry about it? And if it's absolutely destructive, then it seems like, so it's something that should is possible and should be taken seriously. We should
It's possible, it's
analyze
just
it.
undesirable.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes it goes back and forth. So I don't deny that there have been utopians who have said that. But what I find interesting is in the I have two things to say about this. In the practice of utopian tradition, when it comes to democratic contestation, it's often a way of reopening the case of contestation in social life. It is it is a manner of saying, we think that this is the only way we could live our lives. Why is that the case? And some one of my other philosophers I like to draw upon, someone like Ernst Bloch, his argument for utopianism is, it's often thought that utopianism, whenever people describe this is why I sometimes find very strange. I get it. I say it, I get it. It's as if utopianism is simply these ideologues. And by ideologues, I mean people who work with ideas. These individuals who are just in their armchairs scribbling papers, but utopianism speaks to nobody else on the planet. There's this idea that the working class and real human beings, they have no truck for it. But someone like Ernst Bloch, he's saying, well, no, utopianism permeates our life, and every sigh for a better world, in every hunger that we have, in this every sense that we have something is missing from our social life. He thinks that's evidence that actually utopia, is rather constitutive of what it means to be a grounded human social being. But if you deny that and make utopia simply this thing that elitist intellectuals do, then you also have a way of simply just either bracketing out or explaining very real struggles, very real gaps, very real contradictions in ordinary people's lives. And so, if that is the case, then it seems to me something like this. That utopia isn't about coming up with perfect plans. It is actually the expression of democratic desire for a different world in which our needs are met. And the terms of how we meet those needs, that will always be contestable. And I don't think any one person can say we'll all agree on it. But at least utopia can bring into relief certain social needs that we have that have not been made explicable yet. That have simply been assumed that's just the way things are, or these people don't matter, or they're not the right citizens we should be concerned about. And so for me, I always wonder, I think about it this way. We might never have utopia, but I actually think we'll miss it when it's gone. I'm trying to imagine a world in which we have no sense that there is something, that there's a different manner in which we can arrange our lives, that, this is all there is, and that all that we have left is management. Simply managing contradictions, simply managing the status quo, because that's what it means to be a grown up. And now that we set aside our dreams, but if you look at the social movements that have really altered the political landscape, if you want to talk about the American Civil Rights Movement, if you want to talk about anti-colonial efforts, if you even want to talk about, as obviously as misbegotten as some of it became, the Soviet experiment, or if you want to talk about suffragists, all of that before it accomplished what it did was utopian. Tell me someone who in 1943, if you told them, by the way, there's going to be landmark legislation that is going to effectively outlaw segregation, and they'd be, oh yeah, no, that's obviously going to happen. That most people wouldn't. That would seem like really incredible, and try to tell them something like, and some black people will be upwardly mobile and CEOs of companies, and all of this, that would have been ridiculous. And yet that political effort did happen. And so that tells me it wasn't waiting for someone to say, here's what the perfect world looks like. It says that, human beings are creative creatures operating under, burdened contradictions, but that still means it is an essential part of their political agency. And we should have some humility, when we simply think that we know what's impossible, when so much of our world would have seemed impossible if you just go back a couple generations.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I do also wonder, so like, seems like a lot of what you're talking about utopianism is like, a sense that the world could be dramatically different, and in ways that are hard to imagine right now, right? And certainly any kind of radicalism is going to need to be utopian in that sense, right? I mean that without that, I mean you're just like doing liberal reformism, right? That's
Yeah, the world is a fallen place, and yet we're fallen creatures. And so, what else is there to do except try to guard your own soul? Yeah.
yeah, right. So right, for sure, right? So that makes sense. I am curious, like to go back to Thomas More, right? He said, okay, so in the first half of the book, he's he's sort of talking about the ridiculous things about the status quo, about the idea that there's something that's actually unrealistic in the sense of like utopian in the bad sense of about thinking that peasants driven off their land by enclosure aren't going to steal and things like that, right? But then the second half of the book is where he's getting into it's a little ambiguous, but a vision of something that in many ways would be better, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
I think so.
so and it's that second part, right, that I think some of these left critiques of utopianism are objecting to, and I'm curious about like the extent to which you think there's a case for that, or like whether you think there's a case for like
Mm.
for for doing the drawing up the occasional blueprint, not because you think like
Hmm.
like okay, this is something you guys did an episode recently about a book by Karl Kautsky, and I listened to that, and and I I like the episode. I like Kautsky. I like it when he's praised, But they have but one of the sort of Kautsky points that came up in there, right, was his sort of very traditional Marxist, like anti-blueprint, kinds of
Yeah.
kinds of views, and I wonder if there might be something to be said for writing some recipes for the cookshops of the future,
Hmm.
um, in a way that sort of I mean, as a way of keeping alive utopianism in your primary sense, and as a that there might be just a sense that like, okay, you can take on board all of those right to the sort of
Hmm.
strong form of utopianism, right? You can take on board the idea that um it's bad to be not be alive to the ways in which historical contingency, what's materially possible at any given time or whatever, constrain
Hmm.
what you could do. um there's no point like coming up with with like saying, oh, I object to this society because it's not this thing that would be impossible anyway, or like that's not this thing that like we don't know how to do it in a way that would be desirable anyway. uh, and there's certainly something to the sort of logistical and democratic complaints that like it would be absolutely ridiculous to think like, okay, like we huddle for a while and like come up with like, okay, here's exactly how we think that a future society should work, and then expect that like everybody for the next 50 years is just gonna like
Like, yeah, cool. Like, yeah. I mean, if y'all said it though, sometimes it feels like in American society, the founding fathers are treated that way.
oh, that's true.
But far
No,
be from me. But like, but those are the non-utopians, though, right?
yeah, no,
Yeah.
very much so. And yeah, we end up having these bizarre arguments about like, what exactly they were thinking with like, individual sentences that's like I don't,
When you start to think about it, it's really wild, and it does not seem like a really functional way to run a society. And yet the people who make these arguments for this society, when you try to offer even provisional plans of how things would work differently, it's immediately shut down as that's ridiculous because that doesn't belong to the framing of the constitutionalism that at some point we all agreed to. It actually feels more like a bunch of people in the past agreed to it and saddled us with it. And so, again, I think it's important to glimpse those moments where what is called the very sort of pragmatic and practical way of running social life, or organizing social life is probably a better way to put it, are deeply impractical, and if you keep pushing, deeply nonsensical. And so I do understand, the critique of blueprints for the future, if it's understood as, some select number of individuals get in a room together and get their own assent, and then they just, impose it upon, a society that's rife with contradictions, that's rife with disagreements, etc. But on the other hand, I think we should be rather suspicious of the effectivity of those who want to make a case that life could be organized differently, and yet refuse to say any
How?
details about how that would look, how it could come about, etc. I mean, it's a great way to immunize yourself to critique, because you're not putting anything on the table to be contested. So I do wonder, sometimes people take that Marx line, and like, Marx, like any other thinker, is, open to being like decontextualized, and like things are turned into slogans. I guess I'm on board with the idea that sometimes I think this is a bit of a cliche, because I do not understand if the worry is something like, an attempt to sidestep democratic, contestation, or an attempt to no longer analyze, actual social conditions, the relations and forces of production, et cetera, et cetera. I don't understand why we wouldn't think that when we offer these blueprints, that makes them available for critique. And through that critique, you actually gain an even deeper understanding of the social forces in your lives. It just seems to me that's just skipping what's going on. It's assuming that anyone who comes up with any outline of where life could go given what is here must be anti-democratic and must be imposed with authoritarian measures. So what's interesting with the second book of Thomas More, it is actually genuinely ambiguous whether he's saying we need to go there, but I can tell you a part of the function that it is serving is, it is only utopia because it's relative to a crisis-ridden society it's attempting to critique. So one big thing that you'll notice if you read the second book of Thomas More's Utopia is they don't have money there. Clearly, Thomas More is trying to make some sort of social critique, and again, it's not a Marxist critique. It wouldn't make sense for it to be a Marxist critique. He was writing before Marx, but he's saying something about money corrodes social relationships, and he's trying to put that on the table. Now I get it, some people, perhaps following people like Adam Smith or something like that, might say, well, that's not true. So money actually facilitates social coordination, etc. But at least he's putting it on the table as something available for us to discuss, critique, and actually ask, so what is it that money does in a society? What is it that what vision of society does money carry within it about how we will organize ourselves? And to be able to ask those questions, it's not actually always easy. And so to say that we don't want any sort of cookbooks for the future, I mean, it seems like you're evacuating the critical potential to reflect on the very site in which you live. And if you can do that without some sort of step beyond the limit of your life, I'd like to see it, but I don't understand. I don't understand how critical thought works that way.
No, totally. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's a good, yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts about that. I mean, one, I think that one function of thinking about how future society could work is precisely to pry open people's imaginations so they could like they could think about ways to go even further in the same direction, right? I mean, this is something Seth Ackerman wrote an article several years ago for Jacobin called "The Red and the Black," where he talks about like the calculation debates for socialist planning and stuff like that, and he lays out a sort of a vision of like one way that like those problems could be gotten around. And I don't even particularly I think his preferred solution isn't even necessarily the same as mine. That's not the point, right? It's that I really like the way that he frames it at the beginning of the article, where he sort of says, "Look, I'm trying to come up with a sort of way that, like, keeping a lot of things constant from our society, we could have something different, not in order to foreclose further change, but precisely to sort of convince people that, like, fundamental change is
It's
possible." Yeah, exactly, right. And I think that I also think that there's a sense in which, like, we might have a particularly good reason to maybe, write a few recipes now in 2022, which is that, so many people don't really think it's possible, right? That there are, I mean, even, like, obviously, the revival of some sort of socialist movement in a limited way is a tremendously positive thing, but, like, there's very little actual socialism in it, right? I mean, there's like, most, like, even you sort of get this spectrum that goes from, sort of good, honorable social democratic policies in the short term and not much after that, right? To a very vague kind of anti-capitalism, right?
Yeah.
That, like, there isn't
It's
real.
very in vogue to be anti-capitalist now, which you can take as maybe a good sign of things to
Sure.
come, or the idea that it's become a phrase that's been almost evacuated of actual political content and substantive practices and visions of what it would mean to be anti-capitalist. And to me, that says something like I'll go on record and say that I think people who are still fighting utopianism, I almost want to say you're fighting a battle that has already been won a long time ago.
Yeah.
It's unclear to me who it is that you think are these utopians that are threatening society. And honestly, you look around, most people are not utopians at this
No,
moment.
not at all.
And even when they make the sounds of utopianism, there isn't the organizational capacity, and sometimes it seems like there isn't even really the belief that this is something that leads to something else. It's more of a sort of a moral badge that one has. One should say that they are anti-capitalist, but what practices fall from that? Well, nothing that would generate a broad restructuring of social life. And so when I look at it like that,
Mhm.
I almost want to say, is it the problem that we have now is that people's imaginations are flying too freely, that they really think that they can just remake the world with their own individual will according to blueprints they generate in their head? I don't think so. And so you could say on the one hand that utopianism is depoliticizing, disengaging, and I always say, what do we have now?
Mhm.
And isn't there so much depoliticization, disengagement happening, save for what seems to be a labor movement that is struggling to come back to life. But notice that when this labor is struggling to come back to life, and you look at people like what is his name, Chris Smalls, the
Mhm.
Amazon warehouse, they're talking about a different form of social life that we could have, and that again is a spark of utopianism. And so, for me, I always want to think about it this way. I always think about it in two ways. One,
Mm.
when people critique utopianism, I look out at the world and I think utopianism didn't do that to the world. So you're going to have to come up with a different explanation. It isn't the utopians who, kind of wreck social life for millions and millions of people. But then on the other hand, when I'm talking to people who I'm probably more sympathetic with, I get it. Social action is complicated. I don't pretend to have all
Sure.
the answers, but I'm offering my explanation of how it is people start engaging in the really difficult work of reconstructing their social life. And I think they do it because they have a sense of possibility.
Mhm.
Maybe they're wrong, maybe history will prove them wrong, but I have a hard time explaining human action if people, completely forgo anything that utopianism has to say, and they are simply being, understanding themselves as these are unchangeable conditions, and yet I will struggle. I don't think that is actually explanatory for how social change happens. It's a nice story because it means that social change will happen no matter what. So that's great, but I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think about Michael Albert has a video on YouTube somewhere where he he's talking about how much he hates the phrase "fighting the good fight." You know, it's like
Mm,
look, if you're
mhm.
just fighting to fight, I mean, man, just like just go to the
Okay.
beach or something. Like why like
Why
why?
do this? Why? Yeah, yeah. Sometimes, fighting, fighting the good fight, or the struggle is the point. Like I've actually found myself to become, and I think this is because I've gotten deeper and deeper into the utopianism stuff. I don't think struggle on its own has even moral worth. I don't
Mhm,
think we should, romanticize struggle or terms like resistance. I often find myself saying to people, I don't want to talk about resistance. I want to talk about transformation.
mhm.
Resistance, kind of assumes, I'm always going to be playing this negative force. I'm never going to overcome it, but at least, I showed up for the fight, and that's the best I can say. But if you look at people who participate in these movements, they didn't think of themselves as, it's just good to struggle. They thought, no, we're going for the world. We want a new world. And so, sometimes I worry, and I realize how I'm sounding here. I worry about overly moralizing politics
Mhm.
and making it, a badge of how you can become a good
No,
person.
I
I think, don't get me wrong, it's great to be a good person, but
sure.
politics does not have some sort of intrinsic value.
No,
You know,
absolutely. I think it's a great. I think it's. I actually I'd go even further. I'd say it's great to be a good person, but I think it's a. I think it's bad for both the kind of project of some kind of liberatory politics, and it's also bad for like people for like interpersonal relations to conflate the two, right?
mm,
To sort of
no, yeah.
that sort of project of being a good person and and try and change the world. In fact, like I think what makes a good person is often really different, right? I mean that they have like I don't know. I mean I don't particularly admire people who make absolutely no distinction between their friends and family members and like everybody else, right? Whereas
Yeah,
right?
what type of social life, what type of vision of social life is that? And so this is another thing with utopia, that it's trying to make the basic argument that your social practices and your conduct not only imply something about you, they imply something about the set of social relations in which those practices will be intelligible. And so it is actually also a way of returning a sense of responsibility and understanding of ourselves as socially situated and determined creatures, and and to ask, why is it that my conduct is this way? And notice this flips the relation, rather than it's like, why am I a bad person? How should I change myself? It's asking, why is it that I have this type of conduct, these types of practices that are intelligent within this form of life? Well, it turns out, there are these incentive structures that are in place for these such and such reasons. But in order to see that, you need to see them as not simply natural outgrowths, but actually, outcomes of political organization, even from people who have been long dead and were still
Mhm.
saddled with what they did. And this shows you how much of our world is the fruit of political struggle rather than some sort of natural, this is the way that things are. And so I actually kind of flip it. I think most people think utopianism is a form of moralism, and I don't think that that's usually what utopians are doing. What utopians are doing is they want to make the world contestable again. And so
Mhm.
it is not about conserving one's soul or consciousness again. Great things to do within certain spheres of your social life where you make distinctions between friends and family and
Mhm.
all of that. But it is actually about grasping what are the complete sets of relations that systematically lead to our experiences of need and hunger and deprivation, and ask, must it be that way? Is it
Mhm.
rational for it to be this way? That's why I don't want to romanticize struggle. And I don't think that there will be a world in which there is no struggle
Sure, of course
whatsoever.
not.
Look, I struggle to get out of bed. I don't think any utopian society
Yeah,
will stop me from having pain in my back. Okay,
right.
I get it, but I also don't think that all forms of struggle are necessary to social life as such. And
No,
I don't
exactly.
want to engage in a type of way of thinking where all struggle is necessary struggle, when the point is, there are certain struggles that we do want to end. We want to end the struggle over food insecurity. I assume we'd like to end the struggle over, climate sustainability. And to actually say that those are things that we should want, because whatever we want to decide about social life, it'll probably be easier without struggles that inhibit us from actually engaging with our fellows or apprehending the world clearly.
Yeah, I think so. I think, and I think the point you made about the connection between, moralism, right? And I'd make a distinction between that and just like, morality, right? That they have that moralism, right? The sort of intense focus on like morally judging, individuals, and the lack of any sort of horizon for winning, right? That
Yeah.
for ending struggles, I think makes a lot of sense to me. The argument made in the past is that it's if you sort of see yourself as a permanent opposition, right? I mean, all you think you're really doing is registering this kind of moral protest against the injustices around you, then
Hmm.
it makes a lot of sense that you end up spending a lot of time, like I think it's a very natural extension of that to like start spending a lot of time being like, okay, but that guy over there, is he really like
Hmm.
as opposed to it as I am? Like,
Hmm.
does he really feel in his heart the way that I do, right?
Does he
Uh,
really get it? Does he really have the vibe? What's funny is moralism is actually think is profoundly anti-utopian.
mhm.
A lot of like moralistic discourse, I think those of us on the left and obviously on the right do not like, almost assume that there are these unchanging facets of society, and the best one can do is register that they know that this is bad.
Mhm.
And I sometimes think something about utopia to go all the way back to Thomas More. When you go to utopias, when you take to utopias, it isn't even these are perfect people in
Mm.
this society.
Mhm.
It's as if again, it's unclear how Thomas More feels about the whole picture that he's creating. But the thing that he's saying is that you can still have imperfect people in substantially better social conditions. And so that's why I will always contest the idea that utopianism is expecting this sort of Promethean effort in which people are no longer people. No, it understands that people can be radically different in radically different social settings, but that doesn't mean that they'll be perfect. And we don't need people to be perfect in order to have a better world. But I think simply saying that people won't be perfect, that doesn't commit you to the idea that things like racism or
Mm.
sexism, or whichever, or whiteness and all that are simply unchanging, obstinate,
Mm.
trans-historical forces on society, because actually that's a way of severing them from whatever political conditions make them viable, and simply make them almost the background of nature. They're simply what you have to struggle against. You can't control hurricanes, you can't control earthquakes, you can't control volcanoes, you can't control whiteness, and it's just a feature of the landscape. And I think that's profoundly disempowering, and also creates really frayed social relations and things that are just inexplicable when you want to make your case to broader publics.
Yeah, and I mean, whiteness is a good example there because or that's maybe like a particularly funny example, right? Because that's something that's like historically, that's like 5 to 10 minutes ago, right? That's
And scholars have done really good work saying, oh, wait, that's when it started cropping up as a salient social category amid other social forces to to advance some sort of claims or some sort of gains of power. And that tells you, I think that's important.
no, for
And
sure, for
yeah.
sure. I mean, like a yeah, exactly. And I made this point on the stream last night that like that's something that always hits me every time I go back. My sister lives in the UK. Every time I go visit there after I haven't been there in a few years, there's always like some the right wing press there is always like obsessed with like some new group of like dangerous immigrants, and it's always like I don't know, like Romanians or Croatians or something, and
Mhm.
it's like that's so weird because from American perspective, those are all just white people, right? But it's like, oh yeah, it's
Mhm.
almost as if this is all just like hopelessly contingent and whatever. But I do, I think maybe the last thing I'd say, and then we can wrap up is just like, um, I think that maybe one way to sort of take some of the legitimate critiques of utopianism on board and still see some room for some value in writing at least some possible recipes for the cookshops of the future. Not, mind you, ones that you think that anybody in the future is going to necessarily follow, right? Because that's up to them, right? But
you can't really control what they do. Well,
yeah,
you shouldn't aspire to control what they do.
yeah, exactly. But like, it's just that, in the 20th century, in fact, part of the reason that in mainstream discourse, utopianism has such a bad rap, right? Is because in the 20th century, there was the Soviet Union, there's the People's Republic of China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and these societies all existed for a little while, but they have they were beset by various problems, and lots of bad things happened, and that helps to lead many people to think, well, okay, maybe what we've got now sucks, but I mean, like, if you try to change it in a fundamental level, right, you're just gonna maybe even make it worse, right? And if you want to, it makes a lot of sense to me to say that, okay, if you want to like address that source of imaginative resistance to the idea that we could, not just be anti-capitalism, but be pro something that comes after capitalism, then it makes sense to think, well, you want to sell people on the idea that something else is actually possible. And if you can at least create a sort of, if you can at least sort of sketch out a plausible sounding scenario for what that something else might look like, right? That helps make it not seem like either like this is just like it's like hurricanes or whatever, they suck, but like you can't abolish them, they or that it's I guess the related thing, right, which is that there's always this, goes back to what you're saying about Hayek, right, that like, well, maybe it would be possible at least temporarily to create something else, but it would be a disaster, and who wants that, and you're better off the way you are.
Yeah, I think that's right, and so it seems to me, some of the really difficult work with utopianism that I'm trying to do is, partially I want to shed these, what I would call, ideological obfuscations that have attached to the concept as if they are intrinsic to the concept as such. And so, I have talked about utopianism elsewhere, and the amount of times people have yelled Stalin at me, as if that must be what I am talking about, as if like I must be okay with something like starvation or something like that, and I think that's a way again of cutting off the conversation. And so there seems to me at least two resistances to utopia, and I think this goes back to my kind of semi joke about Hayek. They're impossible. And so this idea of trying to radically change society, you look at things like the Soviet experiment, People's Republic of China, or other things. You can look at also minor utopias that eventually just got swallowed up and all that, and say, well, you tried those things, but it turns out radically changing the world isn't possible. To that, I think something that's really important about utopia is actually the world that we have, with the way that we have a market that functions so centrally in our lives, was not always this way. And in fact, for people who eventually were won over to this vision of the world, they were also utopians. Hayek would never call himself a utopian, but he is describing a kind of a utopia for capital. And
Right.
my point there is, without trying to be too polemic, well, it turns out, it was possible to radically restructure the world, and we're living in that world. But it's just that it happened so long ago that it seems as if, well, this was just a natural outgrowth rather than a series of political decisions that, with some luck, happen to be successful. And so I think utopia offers a retrospective way of looking back at our social life and seeing, oh, this isn't just some natural unfolding. These were contests that were won and lost. The other issue is that okay, so utopia's not impossible, but it's obviously terrible. there are two ways to think about this. One, when people talk about things like starvation and uprooting people's lives and degrading the social conditions of their existence, sometimes like, are you talking about an imaginary world, or are you talking about the world that we live in now?
Right.
Because as far as I can tell, there is food insecurity. There is increasingly drying up your rivers and people having to migrate north. And so I'm unclear, is it that you just want the disaster to happen on a longer scale? Is that okay? Or you could say something like, I don't see any reason why, simply because some things happened in the past, that's necessarily how they would happen in the future. And if you're a good materialist, that wouldn't even make sense because the social forces are different, the political ideologies at play are different. This is a different constellation of social life, and so that seems to me an illicit induction to say, oh, when you say utopia, you mean failed experiments that happened 70 years ago. Again, that's not a serious conversation. That's why I think to bring it back, that we should be willing to talk about blueprints, because if you don't have some idea, something to say about what you're thinking about life, and you can't even show that that's not a serious conversation, or someone's not even engaging with what you're saying, you're just allowing them to fill in for you what they think your blueprints are. And what can you say? I guess you could just say something like, the historical social process will work out the contradictions, and then you'll see. Which, good luck. I hope there's something to that. But
Sure,
I think,
but if
until
that's
proven,
your best pitch, I don't know how many people you're going to convince that way.
exactly. It makes for good inside baseball. I don't think it makes for very good, conversation when you're either in the union room or you're in some sort of social organization. Why would anyone listen to the guys like, I don't know what's all this disagreement about? Obviously, the macro social forces are going to decide. So let's just, let's see where this takes us. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah. So I will say people who want to hear more about what you have to say about this subjects. You have this article in Psyche called "Utopian Thinking Prompts Us to Get Real About Society's Needs." Where else can people check out you and your work?
Yeah, so I work at University of Toronto. You can go to my website, williammparis.com, and you'll find all of my published articles, videos, and podcasts I have done. And on that note, I can't end without saying also you can hear things that I have to say with my other three brilliant co-hosts on What's Left of Philosophy. You can follow us at Left of Phil, and you can find us at leftofphilosophy.com.
All right. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you for having me. Wonderful time.
You just missed my dance. All right, I'm here to save this show. What up, y'all? Hi, J. Andrew.
There we go. Classic Gentrance. You gave me to prepare for the segment tonight a short.
I do me and Jake, we do all the work around here.
Yeah, more or less. I barely know what's going on. So gave me this short instructional philosophy video to prepare for tonight's segment.
When your cable company keeps you on hold, you get angry. When you get angry, you go blow off steam. When you go blow off steam, accidents happen. When accidents happen, you get an eye patch. When you get an eye patch, people think you're tough. When people think you're tough, people want to see how tough. And when people want to see how tough, you wake up in a roadside ditch. Don't wake up in a roadside ditch. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. Call 1-800-DIRECTV.
It never gets old.
All right, is that a good argument for switching to DirecTV?
Well, that would probably get me to switch to DirecTV, but no.
Yeah. So one pithy term for a particular kind of bad argument is a fallacy. So what kind of fallacy would this be?
This is the slippery slope fallacy. You don't want to get on the slope because the slope is slippery.
Yeah. So slippery slope fallacy is roughly something like when if you do A or you let A happen, then that'll lead to B, and that'll inexorably
lead to B,
and that will lead to C, and that will lead to D, and that will lead to E,
and Z is someplace you really don't want to be. So how do you avoid Z?
Well, you better not do A.
You better not, because it's a slope, and the slope is slippery.
So one way of getting clearer about this might be to think about, because I think the interesting part, like, okay, you can kind of see why it's a fallacy if you're thinking about the argument for switching to DirecTV, but
weed is a gateway drug, exactly.
Yes, exactly.
If you don't want to be under the bridge dead with a needle in your arm, well,
yeah.
You know what to do.
Yeah.
Or what not to do.
Sure, right. So what would be, so I think maybe the more interesting, less obvious part is, how to tell when this is not, being committed. In other words, like, I think that something I don't know, I've kind of struggled with in the past with teaching critical thinking classes and stuff. This is part of the line of thought that led to the first book, which I wrote, that has the same name as the show, is that I sort of feel weird about the way that oftentimes we teach fallacies in like critical thinking and informal logic classes, where it's like, okay, here's like a kind of pithy definition and some, and like some like super obvious examples, and see if you can kind of identify these like super obvious toy examples to test. And the problem with that is that, if people are paying attention, which not everybody does in every class, but if people are taking attention and taking it to heart, then they end up like, it's like a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. Like they end up sort of seeing these everywhere, whether they're being committed or not.
Fallacy.
Exactly. That every time you cite expert opinion, you're doing the appeal to authority fallacy, whatever, so it's like, I think the much maybe more challenging and worthwhile thing to teach is like some sort of sense of judgment about when.
Which is what critical thinking is, really, a sense of judgment.
Exactly. So do you have an example in mind of a case where somebody might think this is being committed, but it's not?
I mean, the thing is, sometimes reasonable people can disagree on whether you've got a slippery slope going or not. This is my argument actually against mandatory vaccinations, because I don't want the government messing around with my body, my body, my choice kind of thing. But, we back in the day, we did things like mandating sterilization of crazy women, and we don't want that. I
believe the first time you said that to me, I said, I think that's the slippery slope fallacy.
But to me, what makes the difference is there evidence that A will lead to B and B will lead to C? And we've already seen that done in this country. So I think we should just stay out of other people's bodily autonomy, because we've seen what the government will do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's I think there's a question about whether, if that happened in the past, it happened because, like, you started messing around with just a little bit of violation of bodily autonomy, and before you know it, you're going into the hard stuff. But at the very least, and we actually did an episode, I don't know, months ago, years ago, who knows, all blurs together. But we did an episode where Professor Richard Wolff and Branko Markotic from Jacobin came on to have a very civilized debate about vaccine mandates, and I think they both made good points.
Yes, Jake, that is exactly what I'm saying.
There we go. But as much as I'm maybe a little bit more lukewarm on that example, I will at least give you that is an example where like Z is not just like some crazy nonsense that somebody made up, right? Z is an actual historical phenomenon. So like there's the idea that like Z is a danger, at least. Like we could argue about whether A is going to lead there, right? But like the idea that Z is a danger doesn't come out of nowhere. Whereas like, I don't know, I remember 20 years ago when the world was young, or at least I was,
you were not young 20 years ago.
I was in college.
Don't tell these people lies.
But back then, right, like a very common, like a surprisingly common right-wing argument. Like this is not like a straw man that I'm making up here. Like this is the kind of thing you would hear a lot.
Straw man, that's a different fallacy.
It is a different fallacy. We'll do that a different week.
Fallacy. It's like on What We Do in the Shadows. Bat.
Exactly. Is that we can't have gay marriage because once you throw the definition of marriage into question, then who knows where that'll lead. People will be marrying trees, and I don't like.
People are marrying holograms now of anime characters. That's a thing.
Okay, well, I guess the right wingers were right. Never mind. I withdraw that example.
I don't think it was official, but there was a ceremony and everything.
Yeah,
it's very beautiful.
I don't think the state's going to recognize that anytime soon.
Probably not. And not to, if that's your deal, that's your deal, man.
I mean, Rick Santorum who is a I was not. I was an undergrad 20 years ago. Rick Santorum, who's not just some random crazy person. He was a U.S. senator, ran for president after saying this, and was a competitive candidate in Republican primaries. Famously said in an interview, he was talking about like, well, if we give like all these rights to gay people, where's that going to lead? And he used the phrase "man on dog." Mm-hmm. And so,
you notice how it's only men who would be marrying their dogs, not women.
Fair enough.
And if there was the whole, if we allow women to vote, then dogs are going to be voting. And I would rather have our dog voting than some of the people. But anyway, that is neither here nor there. I mean, maybe as a woman, I am more sensitive to this stay out of my body argument.
I see. You're going to bring out the big guns. And
No, I'm just saying it's a thing that as far as I know, there's, and I'm not saying this is we hate women, we're trying to control women, that this is somehow women directed. It's just a fact that biological women are the ones who get pregnant. But I don't see anyone coming after your bodily autonomy as a man.
Sure.
Now, perhaps one day, there might be something, but right now there's not.
I guess historically, I think probably like sterilization and stuff like that. I mean, there was some, but yeah, I get what you're saying, right? I mean, certainly the immediate issue post Roe v. Wade, is very much about biological women. So yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I think that I think this would be a case where Z, right, being the all of the various scenarios about dogs, like Z is not like it's not even like, okay, is A really going to lead there? It's also like, why would that happen? That doesn't, there are a lot of places you could get off the boat in between, and there are, perhaps.
But are you on the boat or are you on the slope?
There we go.
That's
maybe it's a sled. Right, it's going.
Have you ever read Calvin and Hobbes? You can't stop those sleds.
I used to love Calvin and Hobbes. Not that I ever stopped enjoying it, but I haven't read it in a long
Should read a daily Calvin and Hobbes. That's my life advice. I give my students life advice all the time. Usually something that's going on that's frustrating me. And I come in, I'll put my stuff down. I'll be like, life advice, y'all. And then so that's my life advice for today. Read Calvin and Hobbes daily.
All right. Fair enough. Well, on that note, we are going to end the main show. I'm going to go to the post game with Jake and Andy and Dr. Kuba from This is Revolution. So
Revolution!
Yes. Check that out. Love it when you do the Espanol.
It's El Espanol.
Love it. But yeah, if you are not already a Give Them an Argument patron, you can go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. $5 a month. You get a patron exclusive post game after every regular Monday night episode. You get access to the Discord server. Sometimes we do other bonus episodes. I think we're going to try to do another movie night soon. We haven't done one of those in a while. But most importantly, you get our eternal love and gratitude for helping to keep this thing going. So if you like what we do here, do consider doing that. If you're already a patron, you should have gotten an email a while ago with the link for the post game. I will see people then.
Team Snoopy, para siempre.
Left is best.